Hi, welcome to Maiden on the Matriarch. My guest today is Benjamin Goldman. He's Assistant Professor of Economics at Cornell University, and we spoke today about his research on marriage. So, why non-college educated Americans have seen plummeting marriage rates over the last century or so, how sex ratios affect dating culture, how male left tail phenomena like joblessness and incarceration affect the marriage market, and why Americans actually very rarely marry outside of their class or ethnic group. As always, the extended version of the episode is available at louiseperry.substack.com, where you can also find everything else associated with the podcast, including the writing that I put on Substack and the MMM chat community. And another reminder that the young adult edition of the Cases Against the Sexual Revolution is now available. If you know a teenager, boy or girl, who would benefit from reading an abridged version of the book specifically written for a young audience in mind, then please do think of buying them a copy. Okay, Benny, can we start by, I guess, defining assortative mating or assortative marriage in sociological terms?
Yeah, so the terminology assortative mating is typically what one would use to refer to the notion that people tend to match with their likes, right? So someone who is high income or high education might want to match with someone who is similarly high income or high education. That is the sense in which relationships would be assortative if you see a lot of folks of similar status pairing off with one another.
So quite a common idea that you'll hear in kind of manosphere spaces, right, is that women mate hypergamously, so that women will try to date up, particularly the socioeconomic spectrum, and marry up the socioeconomic spectrum as much as they can. But something that we see in the literature, and which you've looked into, is that people marry like much more than that narrative would predict. So actually that people tend to marry people who are remarkably similar to themselves, particularly socioeconomically.
Yeah, I think part of what can get confusing in these discussions about marrying, like, quote unquote, up and down, one, of course, it's going to depend quite a bit on the context in which you're talking about. So, are we thinking about education? Are we thinking about income? And then, even within those buckets, you can think about various coarsening of the definitions of education, for instance, right? So, one can just say, did you go to any college at all or not? One can then think, within the set of colleges, 4-year versus 2-year, elite, less elite, and so on. You can even think about describing patterns of marriage sorting along dimensions like race, which might in turn have no kind of obvious ranking or link to this terminology in some sense. And so I think it's far more complicated than the simple narrative of folks marrying up or down. And what I'd say is that in general, you do see strong patterns on average. So just to give one example, folks who go to a 4-year college in the US, for instance, are about twice as likely to marry someone who also went to a 4-year college than to marry someone who did not go to a 4-year college. But it's not as if literally everyone who went to a 4-year college marries someone else who went to a 4-year college. So there's things that are true on average, but there's a lot of individual level variation. There's a lot of changes over time worth talking about alongside that broader context.
Do we have good data on, like, can we break it down? Like, do PhDs tend to marry PhDs? Do Ivy Leaguers tend to marry Ivy Leaguers? How closely are people matching when it comes to education?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in terms of the specificity of Ivy League and other Ivy Leaguers, one could do that, but I have not seen that done yet. So one would need data in the US context that would probably involve linking tax data on who went to which college, because that's where you can also observe who is married to whom. So that has not been done to my knowledge in the US context. There have been some studies in Scandinavian and other countries that have looked at matching within colleges. It's certainly true that one's literal own college is a common place where you can end up meeting your spouse. And then there have been other studies that have looked at patterns for, graduate degree versus regular 4-year degree. Those haven't been the focus of my own work, but you can definitely see specific patterns where definitely folks who have a PhD are more likely to be married to someone with a PhD than someone who has just a 4-year degree.
And I know you do, I want to get back to the education thing because I know you've got a paper on this,
Yeah.
but it's really quite rare, right, for people to marry across big gulfs in terms of socioeconomics. I think I can't remember the number, you'll have to remind me, but it was always like 2% of people or something have a spouse who's, if they're in the lowest decile, who's from the highest.
Yeah, so again, I think here it's worth drawing out distinctions between different concepts. So when one thinks
Mm-hmm.
about something like income, you can think about a long period of time, until 50 or 60 years ago, where it was almost atypical for women to work. And so,
Mm,
in some sense, by definition, there was a big gulf if one were to just literally look at earnings. Now, of
mm,
course, that's probably a less interesting dimension to look at when we're in a kind of extreme equilibrium where it's less common for women to be working. But your intuition is right about education. So, the statistic I think you have top of mind there is the fraction of Americans who were born in 1930 who end up in a marriage where the wife has a 4-year college degree and the husband does not. That was
mm.
only 2% of Americans born in that year. And it's been
Okay.
rising over time for reasons we can get into.
Mm.
But it's both because of changes in marriage patterns and changes in the broader landscape of who is going to college in the US.
So let's talk about that, right? So am I right? In the 19 people born in 1930, not many of them would go to college.
Yeah, so there was important differences to think about by gender. So if we were
Mm-hmm.
thinking about 4-year colleges and universities in the US, about a fifth of men born in 1930 were going on to 4-year colleges, and about just 10% of women were going on to 4-year colleges. So you can think about the marriage market from the perspective of college women looks pretty darn good if your goal is to marry a college educated man. There's about two of them for every woman on college campuses during that period.
And this is the period where people talk about going to college to get your MRS.
Yes. Now, when was the sharp cutoff when the MRS period ended? I don't know, and I am not the expert to speak to that, but I'm sure there are some pockets of the US where that lingo is still used.
But you can see, so if you're going, so say you're born in 1930, you go to college in 1949, let's say, there are twice as many men on campus as women. So you have so many choices available to you.
You have so many choices, and now I don't know the extent to which the broader discussion around MRS degrees related to the ease of finding a match within colleges compared to,
Mhm.
say, still at that point, limited opportunities in the labor market for women in the US, right? That was definitely part of the discourse in the sense that even if one wanted to, had other goals or reasons to go to college and university, the reality was it was still rare to have a kind of entrenched career after having a child for women in that cohort. And so it might have also been just a practical matter in terms of the MRS degree and meeting your partner at that time when one was in college.
So do we know of those women who did go to college in the mid 20th century, what proportion of them ended up marrying men who also went to college?
Yes, exactly. So if we take that set of women and to do this, you have to pick an age. And so the broad patterns here actually aren't going to depend that much on age, but it's useful just to have one in mind. And so
Hmm.
for this exercise, we do this by looking at what folks are doing at age 45. And what you see amongst those women born in 1930 who went on to get a 4-year college degree is a little more than half of them ended up marrying a husband who had a 4-year college degree at age 45. About a quarter of them married a husband who did not have a college degree. And
Hmm.
the other quarter of them was unmarried at age 45, either because they
Hmm.
had never gotten married or they had already gotten married and divorced by age 45.
That's quite a
And
high
so
proportion.
it's a high proportion. And I think it comes back to this discussion we were having earlier, Louise, about these broader statistics on assortative mating. You
Hmm.
can see from the experience of that birth cohort that these college women were, 2 times more likely to marry a husband with a college degree than a husband without a college degree. So about 50% versus 25%. One can look at those statistics from two angles. One can say, that's like a heck of a lot of assortative mating. During
Hmm.
that period, only a fifth of men went to college, yet half of these women are marrying a college educated guy. Another view is you can look at that same set of statistics and say, oh, I'm actually kind of surprised that a quarter of those college educated women ended up married to a husband without a college degree.
Hmm.
And so that's the sense in which I think it's worth viewing these things kind of from multiple angles.
Yeah, and also that a quarter of them didn't marry at all.
And a quarter either didn't marry at all or were single because they'd been divorced at age 45. That's right.
Yeah, and so that, for that era, that must have been a bit higher than for women who hadn't gone to college. Or maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know. I actually don't know off the top of my
Yeah,
head.
so actually, amongst at least in the US, for folks born in 1930, one thing that's striking in the data and that's distinct from the experience today, which I'm sure we'll get into, is that there was really no education polarization, especially for women in marriage outcomes. So
Hmm.
at age 45, roughly 78% of both college women and non-college women were married. And
Oh,
so
okay,
this
okay.
this notion of marriage kind of becoming something that's more of a high status thing. It's really new in the US. This did not exist as recently as the cohort of folks born around 1930.
Interesting. And I guess the people born in 1930 would not have particularly high divorce rates because by the time they reached well, maybe they did in later life, but they would have reached the period of really high, like growing divorce rates when they were already middle aged.
Yeah, so there was that period of growing divorce rates kind of in the middle of this period. I think the other factor to consider here is the hazard of going from marriage to divorce tends to increase a little bit over time, right? So if we're
Mm,
looking at marriage rates at age 45, in a period where marriage rates are, people are getting married for the first time at a younger age,
mm,
and sometimes you have more time to be at risk of divorce, right? Whereas in modern era, in modern times, it's quite, folks talk about how college educated folks tend to get married later and later these days, right? And so obviously, then if you're looking at age 45, you have less kind of time to end up getting shocked by a divorce.
mm, mm. Okay, so that's the situation in people born in
1930.
1930. How have things changed since then?
Yeah. So what we're able to do with these data is then fast forward 50 years out to Americans born in 1980. So why do we stop in 1980? Well, again, if we're focused on measuring marriage outcomes at age 45, that's 2025, 1980 plus 45. So that's effectively, one can think about that as today.
Hmm.
And what we've seen over this period is just this huge dispersion in marriage outcomes by education. So, like I mentioned, for Americans born in 1930, if in particular you look at women, more than three-quarters of both college and non college women were married at age 45. If you come out to today, or for the cohort of Americans born in 1980, marriage rates have been very stable for college educated women in the US. So they've gone from about 78% to 71%. So a
Mm,
decline of about 6 or 7 percentage points, but nothing
yeah,
especially striking.
yeah.
Whereas for women without college degrees in the US, they've declined from about 79% to about 52%. So
Mm.
a fairly stark, 27 percentage point decline in marriage rates for women without college degrees.
And at the same time, more people are going to college, right?
Yeah, so that's an important kind of backdrop or piece of context for these trends. So, what has happened to rates of college attendance over this period is one, they've gone up quite a bit from something like 15% to something closer to 40%. Again, talking about 4 year colleges and universities in the US, but the sex composition of individuals who attend college has also vastly changed. So, we mentioned that for the set of folks born in 1930, things looked quite good from the perspective of college educated women. There were nearly 2 men in college for every woman. By the time we get out to today, that has actually dipped below one. So now it's just around zero point 0.8. So there's now more women than men on 4 year college campuses. To put an actual number on it, there's 1.5 million more women than men on 4 year college campuses in the US today.
Wow.
And that gap looks to continue growing. So again, this is kind of against the backdrop of declining education and worsening outcomes at large for men, and especially lower income and working class men in the US. And higher education is one domain in which those patterns have shown through very clearly.
Worsening education relative to women, because there are more men now going to college than their grandfathers did, but it's not necessarily translating into the same advancement.
So I think there's two things. That's an important caveat. So it's definitely worsening education relative to women. So one way to describe the trends in this period is we kind of took down the barriers to education for women, and rates of education and educational achievement and higher education and so on just absolutely rocketed up for women. And things have increased for men, but not nearly at the same rate, which is what's created these gender gaps today. And frankly, in recent decades, there's definitely been a kind of plateauing for men in terms of attendance rates of higher education. But the other thing that I think is worth drawing attention to that might have actually worsened in real terms is these what we would might call in economics left tail outcomes for men. So what you see now is if you look at a measure like what's the probability you end up in the bottom 10% of your high school class, or you end up unemployed, or you end up incarcerated? There we're seeing kind of worsening outcomes for men at the very bottom of the distribution.
And women don't want to marry those guys, right? So,
Probably not.
yeah. So
I don't want to be the spokesperson for all women, but certainly when you look at the data, you see low marriage rates at the bottom of the distribution. If you look at, say, folks without high school diplomas in the US.
yeah. Okay, so talk about how this sex ratio on campus is affecting marriage rates across society.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's worth, I think, taking this in steps because there's a lot going on at once in terms of both the trends in marriage outcomes and the trends in college attendance rates. So
Mm-hmm.
certainly, what's happened is if you look at the marriage market from the perspective of college-educated women, what you see is that in some sense things look a bit worse for them. And that's for two reasons, or you'd expect them to end up looking worse. That's because one, it's now costlier to find and match with a college educated guy, right? There used to be two of them for every one woman. Now there's fewer than one. So there's literally not enough to go around. And the second piece is that outcomes are worsening for this pool of non-college men who have historically married women who don't go to college at very high rates. So it's in some sense harder to match with a college educated guy. And there's been stark changes for the worst in the terms of the pool of non-college men.
Mm.
Yet, so what we see over this period is this poses a bit of a puzzle because we also mentioned that marriage rates for college educated women have been relatively stable. So how is this true? How are these things coexisting at the same time? What you've seen is that much of the kind of decline one might have expected in marriage rates for college educated women has been offset by increased marriage of college women to men who didn't go to college but are relatively well off economically.
So compensating.
Yes, exactly. And so one kind of simple way to look at these data is coming back to that 2% statistic we started with. So in the 1930 cohort, sorry for all the numbers here, but I think they're illustrative for this particular pattern. So among Americans born in 1930, only 2% of folks in that cohort ended up in a relationship where the wife had a 4-year degree and the husband did not. So
Mm-hmm.
just plainly, this was a very rare, almost non existent type of couple at that time. Now that's 10% of all Americans born in 1980. So it's gone up by a factor of 4 or 5, end up in a marriage where the wife has a 4-year degree and the husband does not. That's 10% of all Americans. As a fraction of all marriages, it's closer to about 15%. And, there's good reason to expect this kind of arrangement to continue becoming more prevalent as women continue to outpace men in college attendance.
When these college educated women are marrying men who haven't been to college, the men they're compensating for this lower educational status by having a higher income status. Is that though relative to the women? So are these, basically I'm asking, are these women who went to college but haven't really benefited economically? So actually the women are not well off and they're marrying men who are better off than them, but not necessarily rich? Or are these guys who have somehow bypassed college and nonetheless become very successful?
Yeah, good question. Important bit of context there. So, one kind of question you might have is okay, so now it's more common for college women to marry these non college men. Have they kind of had to make a sacrifice economically in a
Right.
sense? Whereas now they're drawing more from this pool. Have you seen that they're drawing men who have lower earnings on average? When you look at the data of the non college men who marry college women, those folks seem to one, were doing well in the
Mm-hmm.
1930 cohort, the few of them that there were, and they're
Mm-hmm.
doing yet better over time. So you should have
Okay.
numbers in the back of your head like average earnings in the mid 40s of around 60,000 for the set of men born in the 1930 cohort, and that's gone up by about $8,000 or $9,000 to closer to 70,000 today. So these folks are doing, quite well economically. There, it's not just that it's a set of college women who themselves are kind of doing really poorly in the labor market, and they're marrying a guy who might only be earning, say, like $25,000 or $30,000 per year. These men in general seem to be doing pretty well.
Remind the Europause listening what the median earnings are in America
Yeah,
to get some
so
context for like
yeah,
70-ish.
exactly. So yeah,
Yeah.
so it depends on exactly the age at which you look, but in the mid 40s, you should think of something close to around 50 or $55,000.
Okay. So these guys
Yeah,
are
they're doing pretty
doing,
well relative
yeah,
to median,
modestly
and
above average. Okay.
yep, and they don't have college degrees, so this doing pretty well.
Do we have any idea of the kind of jobs that they're doing, like professions which are likely to marry?
Yes, it's a good question. So we don't
Mhm.
unfortunately have this in the data we looked at for this study, but I think this would be an important kind of direction for future work because I think one wants to know what I have in the back of my head is like a nurse married to someone who owns a local small business or like a HVAC technician or an electrician or someone like that.
Yeah, tradesmen. Yeah.
Yes, but this is, me editorializing. I don't actually have the numbers on that front, but I think it would be interesting to look into who exactly these couples are.
In Australia, there's a tradesman. My family are Australian. We were there recently. Tradesmen are a particularly successful group. They're like
Yep.
more successful than in other Anglosphere countries. And there's an expression of a cashed up tradie, which means like a successful tradie. And they have massive houses and they send their kids to private schools. And like it really is a thing that if you go into a trade, you can do really well for yourself and not have been to university. So
Oh,
that's what I
that's
had it.
great.
Oh, that's what I was picturing.
I will say, so Stephanie Murray, who's a writer for a reporter for the Atlantic, has a recent piece on this, looking at exactly these type of couples, and she was able to interview some of them. So I think if folks are interested, I would definitely check out Stephanie's work.
So, in terms of the non college educated women who've seen this massive drop off in their marriage rates, what do you think is going on there?
Yeah, okay, great. So if we look at the set of non-college women, they historically, so again, if we go back to starting in 1930, they largely married non-college men. So I think only about 10% of those women ended up married to college men, and
Mm-hmm.
about 60 or 70% of them ended up married to non-college men. So that's really, you should think about that as their core kind of marriage market.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see over time is that the decline in marriage rates for non college women is fully explained by declining marriage to non college men. So it's really about declines in marriage between non college Americans. What's kind of interesting about this, at least to me, is that non college men themselves are key to both of these trends for college and non college women, right? So for college women, they were able to offset kind of a forthcoming decline in their marriage rates by increasingly marrying the well off non college men. And the decline in marriage rates for the non college women is because they are now no longer marrying non college men. Well, what's happened to the non college men? A moment we were talking about how the ones who marry college women have been doing relatively well. There's actually been a decline in economic outcomes or earnings for the remaining non college men. So, this, just to put in plain terms, is fairly remarkable. Their earnings have declined by about $10,000 in real terms. This is over a 50-year period where the US economy grew by a factor of nearly two, right? So, these
Mm-hmm.
folks are actually worse off economically today than their counterparts were 50 years ago. And so, I thought one nice way to summarize kind of the state of the marriage market for non-college women is you can ask what share of non-college men are marriageable in quotes. So scare quotes around marriageable. I'll come
Mm-hmm.
up with a very crude kind of economist definition of marriageable, which is you have to satisfy two conditions. One, your earnings have to be above the national median. And two, you can't already be married to a college educated woman. So you have to be available. So
Mm-hmm.
if we go back to the 1930 birth cohort in the US, nearly 3/4 of non college men fit the bill. They were marriageable based on this very simple and crude definition. If we go out to today, that's dropped to nearly 34%. So there's
Mm-hmm.
been a huge decline in the marriageability of the non college men, driven both by declining economic outcomes for this group, but then also the fact that college educated women are now tending to marry some sizable fraction of the economically well off portion from the pool. And so things really just look much worse for non college women from this perspective. And that's precisely the group for which we've seen marriage rates decline in the US.
So, to put it crudely, the kind of the college educated women are poaching the most desirable non college educated men.
Yes.
Yeah. And so the remaining pool available to non college educated women is less attractive.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's worth being clear that it's important not to binarize or be too hyperbolic, just in the sense that it's not as if there are zero non college men who have good earnings left on the marriage market, right? It is
Mm-hmm.
still 35% of them kind of fit the bill, and yet we don't see those marriages forming. So, it's not necessarily a one size fits all explanation for this entire phenomena, but
Mm-hmm.
certainly some share of the decline in marriageability for the non college men is due to this kind of cream skimming phenomena, if you will, Louise.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned left tail phenomena. How much do you think that explains this?
Yeah. So one way to get a handle on these kind of worsening or really kind of bad outcomes for some share of the men is to forget about these changes over time for a moment, put that aside. And one can approach this same set of questions geographically, which is to say, let's just take modern dating and marriage outcomes in the US and ask these growing education gaps and marriage rates between college and non college women, where in the US are those largest? Are there parts of the US where there's smaller education gaps? In some sense, they look like marriage markets in the US used to. And
Hmm.
what completely pops out when you do that type of analysis is it's the areas with the fewest left tail outcomes for non college men. So you want to think about areas of the US where men who don't go to college are very likely to be employed. They almost all finished high school. Very few of them are incarcerated. If you zoom in on that subset of areas, many of which are concentrated, say, in the upper plain states, you can think about parts of, say, suburban Minneapolis. When you zoom in on those areas, marriage outcomes kind of look like they did in the US 50 years ago. There's very little gap in marriage rates between college and non college women. Now, if you go all the way to the other end of the spectrum, and there's just huge variation in the US. So, to give you some sense, there's areas in the US where only 65% of non college men are employed. So a third of non college men are not working. And there's areas where nearly 97% of non college men are working. Right. And so if
Mm.
you go all the way to those areas where outcomes look much worse for non college men, that's precisely where you see these massive gaps in marriage rates between college and non college women. So what's happening there is that these men with these left tail outcomes, my best guess is those really are not the men who are the relevant marriage market for college women. And so when you look across these two types of areas, you hardly see any difference in marriage rates for college women. But non college women seem really sensitive to what's going on with the outcomes for the local pool of men who don't go to college.
Mm. And they are behaving rationally because, like, it's a pretty sensible decision to not want to marry a guy who is suffering from this left tail stuff. You can see why women would be put off from that. I don't think they're being sort of hoity-toity by saying that they don't want to marry these guys.
One striking pattern you see in the data is this sensitivity you're mentioning there, Louise, in terms of the response of non college women to the local outcomes for non college men. You see that really much sharper in marriage rates than in fertility rates. So if you look at the probability of having kids, that is not nearly as responsive. So what's happening in these communities where men have these worse left tail outcomes is you actually see, relatively stable rates of fertility in those communities. Those women are having children at nearly the same rates as women in the markets where non-college men are doing well, but they're much more likely to do so out of wedlock. So you're right, women are making the choice not to marry this type of guy, although they still are having children in those areas.
Do we know if they're having children with those guys?
No, there is, unfortunately, we don't see that level of kind of granularity in the data we worked on for this project, but it is
Uh-huh.
something one can explore. And other folks, so Melissa Carney, as you might know, writes a lot on this in this space. She has a nice paper looking at various shocks to male outcomes. So, for instance, the fracking boom in North Dakota concentrated in, certain parts of the US. And she's chosen those environments when men's earning power goes up. You see pretty sizable increases in fertility, but much weaker responses in marriage rate. So it's kind of similar to what we're describing here, where marriage seems more sensitive to what's going on with men than for overall fertility rates do.
Interesting. Is it possible that in these areas where you have a lot of male dysfunction, you're seeing more de facto polygamy, in that maybe the men who are doing relatively better are having children with multiple women and not marrying them, and the men who are doing very badly are not having children with anyone and not marrying anyone? Can we work that out from the data?
It's certainly possible that's true. What would be difficult about directly assessing that in these types of data is so a lot of the input to this type of analysis is something like surveys where they'll just ask you if you're married, or tax data itself where you can see folks who are married, filing jointly,
Hmm.
essentially. And so you don't really see any data on, you know, other relationships folks had or their dating life prior to marriage. One
Hmm.
could, I think, try and proxy for that, thinking about, say, like how long men are waiting to get married, right? That could be a crude proxy for kind of how much choice there is. What I'd say is that, it's interesting to bring that question not only to this kind of space of when men are doing worse, but there's other phenomena that could strain the marriage market and produce that same type of outcome where men at the top of the distribution effectively have a lot of choice, right? And so one hears about this quite a bit in the context of, say, New York City, where amongst young folks in New York, it's kind of a known thing that the gender ratio is very skewed. So there's more women, there's more young women in New York than there are young men.
Interesting. That's true in London as well.
True in London,
Yeah.
and people will say then the opposite about San Francisco, which is
Hmm.
more male, perhaps because there's a lot of tech or STEM jobs in that area. And so
Hmm.
that can itself, in some sense, bring about the same dynamic you're raising, Luis, without the same kind of color that's brought by declining male outcomes. So I do think that would be an interesting path to explore, though we don't see that type of thing in the existing data sets we use for this analysis.
Another thing that I wonder about in those cities is I've read data on casual sex cultures in college campuses, depending on sex ratios. So when there are more men than women,
Yeah.
you have basically women are the more valuable resource, and so they can set the terms, and so you end up with less casual sex and more monogamy and commitment. And then the flip side is when men are the scarce resource, there's more casual sex. I wonder if it's so hard, like just looking at San Francisco and New York, it's such a small sample size. It would be interesting to look into that, whether you see differences in like I don't know, dating app behavior or something in cities where the ratio is different.
Absolutely. What's striking about the literature you're referencing on how sex ratios can impact dating culture is that it doesn't take a very big change off of 50-50 in a sex ratio to induce the type of effects you're referencing, Luis, right?
Mm.
One way to get intuition on this is to think about a situation where that's 55% female, right? And so there you can get 55% female, 45% male. There in a school, say, of 2,000 students, you actually have 100 surplus women, right?
Mm.
And so small changes in the sex ratio can actually have big impacts on the dynamics of these dating markets.
So going back to the marriage question, so these areas which have super low male marriageability, basically, what are the characteristics of these places? What is it that's driving? Like one thing I'm thinking about is race, for instance, because we know there are big differences in marriage rates across races in America.
Yeah, so in terms of race itself, what we actually see very similar patterns for each race group. So it might not be the same areas of the US where, say, white non college men and Hispanic non college men are struggling. But when you take the perspective of the women in those marriage markets, what you see is that across all race groups, these education gaps between women are largest in areas where non college men of that same race group are doing worse economically. And so, in some sense, this pattern is this general theme is shared across race groups. But
Mm-hmm.
then, to kind of directly address your question, the general phenomena of, say, something like non-employment or incarceration is higher for certain race groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, in some sense, even if Black women are equally sensitive to white women to the local conditions, there are just more places in the U.S. where incarceration rates are really high for Black men. And so, in
Mm-hmm.
some sense, this could be a more important phenomena for explaining declining marriage rates for certain groups.
Okay, so you see the same pattern within races, but sometimes it's a more extreme pattern. And people are not. I mean, this. I know that you've written another paper on this. I was surprised to read in this other paper how low interracial marriage rates are. Like so low,
Yeah.
so much lower than I thought.
Yeah. So interracial marriage is a complicated topic in the US. One thing in particular is there's been a lot of focus historically on white Black interracial marriage because
Hmm.
there's a lot of history, of course, in the US, long running racial disparities, until very recently in the US, interracial marriage was illegal across race lines.
Hmm.
And one thing to note is that interracial marriage rates have actually been rising quite a bit over time in the US in a proportional sense. So there many factors are an order of magnitude higher now than they used to be. But for white Black interracial marriage in particular, the overall rate is still very low. And so, just to give you some sense, if you looked at folks in their mid 30s, only about 3% of Black Americans will end up married to a white spouse. That's
Mm.
quite low considering the fact that about 60% of the US population is white. So it's
Mm.
very far off of what we would expect to see if folks were kind of matching into marriages without regard to race.
So, okay, so given the fact that people tend not to marry outside of their race, if you're a Black woman and the men in your community are particularly likely to have these left tail phenomena, particularly incarceration, there just aren't that many options for you, right? So this is a real problem for Black women.
That's absolutely right, Louise. What I'd say, as just a bit of backdrop there, is the fact that folks tend to marry within a race group, the fact that that's such a strong pattern is itself kind of an outcome, right? And so it is, you're right to point out, it makes these trends of what's going on or the general state of men within your own race group more important for the women, right? But it's also possible that one can alleviate some of that pressure by, increased marriage across group lines, which is something we have seen, in the US in recent decades, even though overall rates of interracial marriage, particularly white Black interracial marriage, remain pretty low.
The stereotype, right, is that Black men are more likely to marry interracially, so are more likely to marry white women, and Black women are less so. Is that stereotype true in the data?
Yeah, so again, this is something that's true, but again, it's worth kind of coming at from different angles with the data. So classic economist response, right? Caveat everything. What you see in the data when you look, say, around age 35, mid 30s, is you would see that while it's true that Black men might be something like 20% or 25% more likely to marry a white person than a Black woman is, some sense that 20-25% is big. The difference in level terms or overall how many Black men are married to a white person versus how many Black women are married to a white person is not that big. So it might be something like 1.8% of Black women have a white spouse compared to something, closer to 2.7 or 3% for Black men.
Sure. Is it the case that that admittedly very small proportion of Black men are more likely to be economically successful? Because that's what the that's the cultural narrative, right?
Yeah, so my guess would be, I don't have those numbers top of hand. My guess would be yes, in part because marriage rates overall in the Black community in the US are relatively low. And there's a big positive selection into marriage on the basis of earnings, right? So when you look at how marriage rates vary with economic outcomes, this is true for all race groups, but it's upward sloping, right? So folks who earn more tend to be the folks who are getting married at higher rates. And so my guess is if you compared the Black men who are married to white women versus the other Black men or the unmarried Black men, you would see these types of disparities.
But then you would expect to see that those disparities anyway because of marriage rates
Exactly.
being
Selection into marriage. Exactly right.
yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. How about the interclass marriages? So I think that, am I right that in this paper you wrote on people marrying outside of their race and class groups, you were looking at like the bottom decile, top decile?
What we were doing there, exactly. So we were looking at bottom quartile and top
Quartile,
quartile. So
sorry.
top
Okay.
20, no problem. Top 25% versus bottom 25% of income. And
Mm-hmm.
the sense in which we mean class, we're really just using class as a shorthand in that context for your income you had growing up. So your parents' income. So we're looking at
Right.
folks who grew up in household at the top of the income distribution, the top 25%, and comparing them to folks who grew up in the bottom 25%. And additionally, asking if you grew up in a high income family, what is the probability you end up married to someone who grew up in a low income family? And just as
Mm.
we saw for race, you see, relatively low rates of interclass marriage. So to give you some sense, only about 3% of folks born to high income or top quartile parents are going to end up married to someone who grew up in a low income household. And so that 3% on its own, is difficult to interpret. A natural benchmark would be, what would that look like if folks married without regard to class? And what you would see there is rates of interclass marriage that are somewhere between 2 and 3 times higher than that 3%. And so that's the
Mm.
sense in which, just as it's true for race, there's a lot of sorting into marriages along class lines in the US. And this matters, substantively for many reasons. The two that are kind of obvious and front of mind for my own work is it impacts the overall level of inequality in income in the US, right? So if folks who tend to be high income or come from high income backgrounds marry each other, then when you look at household income, you kind of get into the situation where you're either in a couple where both people are high status or zero people are, if there's not a lot of mixing across group lines where you get these one and one couples. And then the other reason is that, of course, is going to then manifest in terms of the situation that kids in the next generation grow up, right? Kids are either going to be born to parents where, both say might have higher incomes or come from high income backgrounds, have a college degree, and so on, versus kind of having no parent or even a single parent who went to college or has a reasonable income.
How new is it? So obviously the college stuff, we've seen a lot of change across time because of different patterns of particularly women going to college. But for people just generally marrying assortatively socioeconomically, I guess someone like Gregory Clark would say that
Yeah,
this is a tale as old as
phenomena as old as
time.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Louise. This is something we've seen, in human populations. You can do studies like Greg has done going back hundreds of years and document this type of assortative mating. With that said, things do change over time. It's a matter of degree, of course. It doesn't go, from 0 to 100 in a matter of decades. But also in terms of notions like class, we're now getting better and better data to measure these patterns, which in some sense makes comparisons to what things like look like today to 50 years ago more difficult, but it's giving us a finer lens in terms of what might be driving these patterns and so on. So there's kind of an opportunity there as well to dig more into what is driving these age-old patterns.
Mm. You might expect one of the things that's a little bit surprising about this data on how assortatively people still mate is that there isn't really the social stigma attached to, or there's certainly less social stigma now attached to a kind of an unconventional match. So obviously there's so much data showing that over time people have become much more tolerant of interracial marriage since it became, well, it was never criminalized in Britain, but in America, of course, it was. People have just become more and more tolerant of the idea of their child marrying. It's often used as like the benchmark question for racism. How would you feel
Yep.
about your child marrying someone of X ethnicity? I would guess the same thing has happened with class, that people maybe, well, basically people are given more individual freedom to choose their own mate and they're less likely to be affected by family choice. What do you think?
That's an interesting puzzle, Luis, insofar as I think, we might think about the causes or the reasons that sorting along race and class lines arise for, they could very well be different. For instance, it's well known, as you referenced, in the US that just straight racial bias or animus or racism was a large part of what pushed down rates of interracial marriage.
Mm-hmm.
But it's possible, for instance, that there's kind of deeper reasons why people match along class lines. So coming back to the data on education, you might say prefer a partner who went to a similar type of college, who you can, socialize in a similar group with, have a certain type of discussion with, share hobbies with, and so on.
Mm.
That, is in some sense very different than an underlying bias or preference for a spouse of a certain type. And so that is part of what, we do in this work is in this paper on interclass and interracial marriage, we're focused on just one potential cause, which is what some might call in this literature meeting opportunities, which we
Mm-hmm.
proxy with segregation, which is one reason you might see low rates of intergroup marriage might have nothing to do with people's bias or preferences, but just we tend to live our lives in a way where we're more likely to be around folks who are like us. And if that's the pool in which we exist, we might be more likely to draw our partners from that pool. And so that could give rise to these patterns absent any preference or bias.
Well, this kind of reminds me of the argument about when women have more freedom to choose careers, they tend to choose careers that are actually more like stereotypically feminine. So in a way,
Mm-hmm.
kind of way, you lift restrictions and people actually will express their true desires more strongly. So it's like people are given more individual choice about who they marry and more exposure to like people all over the country by going to college, and they'll choose the people enormously like themselves.
Yeah, I think one way to kind of restate that, Louise, is if you take something like interracial marriage in the US, if you have a regime of almost complete, institutionalized segregation,
Mm,
in some sense, that de facto reveals the fact that the population is very racially biased. But one
mm,
could also look at that and say, well, we haven't really learned anything about patterns of interracial marriage in that world because, one, it might literally be illegal, or two, we're not actually providing opportunities for people to meet and see what happens. And then I think you're exactly right. Once you lessen those constraints or lift the veil, if you will, then you can kind of see how things unfold and how matches form absent those types of constraints.
And it turns out that people mostly actually just want to marry people who are like themselves. It's almost
Yeah,
funny.
right. So it depends. One thing we show in this new paper is it depends a bit on the dimension you're looking at. So
Mm,
what you see for class is that actually there looks to be really strong effects of segregation on rates of interclass marriage. So if you look at folks
okay.
who are living in class diverse neighborhoods, in terms of if you're from a high income family, you have a lot of neighbors from a low income background, you see that interclass marriage in those environments is just substantially higher than folks who are living in very class segregated environments, which
Mm,
suggests that actually in that context, kind of lifting the veil and giving people an opportunity to match across class lines does end up producing substantially higher rates of interclass marriage than we would have had in a world of kind of complete class segregation. But what we
mm,
see for race and in particular white black interracial marriage in the US is kind of a much flatter gradient there, which is even in the most racially diverse neighborhoods and cities in the US, you still see very low rates of interracial marriage. Now,
mm,
that's consistent with kind of what we're talking about, an ingrained preference people might have for the race of their partner or marrying within their same race group. It's also consistent with kind of further barriers to segregation, right? So maybe the veil hasn't been fully lifted in a sense, to come back to the analogy, because even in cities that have a lot of folks are very diverse, they have folks of different racial backgrounds, there could still be a lot of segregation in social interactions for institutional or structural reasons.
mm.
And so, you might not actually be generating a lot of interactions across race lines, even when people are living in the same city.
Thinking about the class factor, I wonder if so one of the effects that college has, right, is that you take people from, so say 100 years ago, your sort of social experience as a young person is you're not likely to move, you're not likely to go to college. Like most women and most men are not going to college. You're expected to marry relatively young. Your pool of possible marriage partners is not that enormous. It's kind
Yes.
of people local to you, and we know that the data on how people meet, right, they were much more likely to
Yep.
meet through church or family friends or things like that. And then now one of the funny effects that college has is it basically plucks out the most academically successful kids in any community and takes them all to the same place where they live together for 4 years. I mean, admittedly, not everyone does like residential university, but this is the model that I'm imagining. And then they often end up marrying each other. You'll suddenly have access to a pool that is simultaneously much bigger and also much more filtered for things like academics.
That's exactly right. It's worth there. It's a matter of degrees in a sense. So
Mm-hmm.
directionally, I completely agree with you, Louise. Today, more than 50 years ago, clearly, it's much more common to have this experience where you leave your hometown, you go to college, you might never even return, right? You might go live in
Mm-hmm.
a city, maybe you come back and visit your folks and so on, but you're living in some sense a different life than the folks who you grew up around. What I'd say though, what's kind of interesting is that it's still true for one, the majority of folks in the US today still don't go to 4 year college and university, right? So while, as you point out, the rates have risen over time, it's by no means the majority of folks. And even among the folks who go, many will go close to home, or many will go and then come back home. So just to
Mm.
give you some sense of this, you could ask, say, take folks at age 27 or 28 and ask what fraction live in the same metro area in which they grew up. If you look at folks who grew up in lower income households, it's about 2/3 of them are going to end up staying put. And if you
Mm-hmm.
look at folks who grew up in higher income households, it's closer to something like 52%. So it's still the majority of folks end up living near home, many of those folks might have gone to college and returned. You can think about a kid who grows up in New York, goes to college at the University of Michigan or something, but then comes back home to New York for a job afterwards. And so, in some sense, you're right, Luis. Like, you have expanded the pool of folks you interact with. On the other hand, the area in which you're born still continues to have predictive power for who you end up married to in the US. So something like a quarter of all marriages in the US are between two folks who were born in the same county.
Mm. That's amazing.
Yeah. And what you see in the data is actually this. I don't have a good explanation for how this operates, but there's a geographic definition in US data called the census tract, which is it's a really small. You can think of something with in a city, something where, that's about a half square mile or 1 square mile. What you see is that you're much more likely to marry someone who was literally born in your same neighborhood or census tract than even someone who grew up like 2 or 3 miles away. So despite the fact that there is this phenomena of people, leaving home, you still see there is quite a bit of geographic specificity in marriage patterns in the US.
That's really interesting. Probably what I'm doing is I'm thinking of the kind of more Ivy League experience.
Yes, exactly, exactly. This
Yeah.
happens when I present this paper in research seminars to audiences of people with PhDs from fancy universities. You can
Mm.
imagine, I get this reaction all the time, which is, you're showing me these statistics about how who one grows up around and lives around ends up influencing who they marry later in life. But, that doesn't make any sense. Everyone leaves home and goes to Princeton and then goes to work in New York or whatever. But, some people do that, but that is not the kind of modal experience of US life these days.
Mm, mm. Yeah, and of course, it's partly because we're talking about such a large proportion of the population now going to college. So there's a lot of
Exactly.
space within that.
The story in some sense holds and changes, right? Like it's right that that is now more common over time, but it's also true that it's not the majority of folks. And I mean, a bit of a tangent, but another way in which geography is really important in dating markets today is just through app-based dating technologies, right? I
Yeah.
mean, in those settings, you literally set a search rate. So I love telling the story of like, I had so many friends when I was in graduate school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is just across the river, a couple miles from Boston. Folks would often say, "Oh, I don't go on dates in Boston. It's just simply not worth it. Like most of these dates are not good enough or worth the time. So I set my radius at 2 miles or something." And you can clearly see in that context, well, that's going to generate a pool of potential partners who looks very similar to you, especially in an area where there's a lot of prestigious universities concentrated together.
So everyone goes to Harvard and MIT, basically.
Exactly. And so,
Right.
it's not as if you opened your Hinge or Tinder or whatever it was and said, show me only Harvard, MIT, and Tufts. But by setting the radius at 2 miles, you've effectively done that, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that's the sense in which these patterns of segregation can end up producing these sorting into marriage outcomes, even if in some sense it's kind of a happy accident.
Yeah. 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 So you mentioned earlier that for this cohort born in 1930, marriage rates between graduates and non-graduates were very similar. And now, of course, there's this divergence, particularly thinking about the non-college educated women. Can we look at the far right tail for this as well? So, like sticking with the Ivy League, I've read, but I don't know the numbers, that actually people who go to basically the elite, socioeconomically, educationally, are still getting married at high rates, are staying married, are basically it's this talk the 60s and walk the 50s kind of phenomenon that Rob Henderson in particular
Yes,
talks
luxury
about.
beliefs.
Yeah, exactly. Have you looked into that data as well in terms of what's happening at the far
At the
right
right
tail?
tail. So
Yeah.
what I find interesting about those patterns, especially for women, is actually if you go back to the 30 cohort, there was a gap in kind of the reverse direction for elite women. So then it was pretty rare for women to go to college, yet rarer for women to go beyond college. But actually, women who went to college but did not go to graduate school had marriage rates about 15 percentage points higher than their peers who went to both college and graduate school. So, and this work, relates to work by Claudia Golden and many others in economics. There was a kind of career family trade off you can think about
Mm.
amongst women in that cohort where you actually see lower marriage rates for women who have this kind of right tail education outcome. They go beyond their undergraduate studies.
Hmm.
What you see when you come out to today is now there's no gap between those two groups of women. So both get married at rates around 70 or 75% when they're in their mid 40s. And so that has actually
Interesting.
disappeared. What you see in the data is actually just marriage rates have been completely flat for the set of women who go on to graduate school. So they started at something like 70%. They maybe ended up at something like 71% for women in the 80 cohort. But there's been this kind of smallish decline for women with just regular 4-year college degrees. And that's what's generated this convergence between the two sets of women, kind of the upper middle class and then the very right tail, if you will, which in this case we're defining by going to graduate school.
Interesting. So we're not necessarily seeing kind of What are we? So-called tall girl syndrome. This is not my coinage, but if women want to marry someone who's taller than them, 6 foot women are going to struggle. Similarly, if women who are very successful educationally and professionally want to marry someone who is more successsive than them, there
They'll
just
run
aren't
out.
right. There just aren't that many options.
Yeah, so this resonates a lot, and certainly something I have peers. I'm lucky to have many, amazing female colleagues who, they've mentioned this type of phenomena as well. Louise, I'd be curious to hear your views on this in the following sense. One thing that we're a bit limited in saying with these types of data when you're just looking at something like marriage rates is you don't really have any sense of like how hard it was to get married and what the quality of the match is, right? And
Mm,
so we're talking about this premise and these trends, like things have been relatively stable for college educated women over time. That's all true in terms of marriage rates. That
mm,
doesn't mean dating isn't harder today. It doesn't mean folks aren't getting married later. It doesn't mean the
mm,
quality of the matches haven't changed over time. So I think that's one very clear limitation of just focusing on overall marriage rates is that this narrative that I think is very present in the media today, that it's become really difficult for women to date. Dating culture has kind of devolved in a sense for many of the reasons you focused on in your work, Luis, but also folks will cite just these kind of growing gender gaps in education, widening gender divides in politics, and so on. That can
mm,
all be true. It's a bit of a puzzle why it doesn't end up manifesting in lower marriage rates for these kind of women in the right tail.
mm.
But the two things could coexist, right? It could be that, women who go to graduate school, they do really want to end up married and have a family. And so they're willing, in some sense, to make a sacrifice either in terms of who they end up marrying or they end up having to spend a longer time dating and trying to find their partner.
Right. So it could be that people in the past, even though marriage rates have remained the same, it could be that now you have to go through this like baptism of fire process of like 10 or 20 years. I think of like my grandparents who met in the most classic way where there's like a local dance and they got married in their early
Right.
20s and immediately had a baby and it was all sort of
Right.
and then were married until my grandfather passed away. That's the kind of seemingly effortless process of finding a mate. That does seem to be sort of rare now. I mean, the only exception would be there are quite a lot of people who meet their spouse at university when they're like 20 and that's it, they're set.
Right.
But there is this common complaint that you'll spend women, particularly in cities like New York, we were talking about, right, where they're kind of an excess
Yeah.
of educated women. They'll spend 10, 20 years having quite difficult dating experiences.
What I find kind of fascinating about this discussion is what the implication is there is like, in some sense, we've invented a new period of young adulthood that didn't used to exist, right?
Uh,
Like, if you went off to college, it was very clear what you did next. I mean, you started by mentioning the MRS degree, but even for men, we go back 50, 60 years, it was very common to get married quite quickly after you went to school. And it
mm,
was then clear what to do. You worked, you started a family, and that was that, right? And there were many issues with that system, including gender inequality in the labor market, women bearing the brunt of child work, not having the same opportunities as men career wise, and so on. But now we have kind of this other extreme, which I think you've written very eloquently about, which has come along with this kind of maybe some weird dating dynamics that might not be optimal, but then also this decadal or more period where it's kind of like, what do I do? What is my purpose? So I find this interesting in terms of what the experience of that decadal period is like and how it might differ for men versus women. My own intuition, if I
mm.
had to guess, is men don't handle it quite as well. And you often see this as the period of time where men can kind of fall off the rails a bit. But I don't know, and it'd be interesting to see folks look at this in a bit more detail.
The episode is not over. There is another maybe 30 minutes of content, but it is behind a paywall. If you would like access to that content, if you would like to show support for the show, paid subscriptions are what keep it on the road. Allow me to pay my producers, put food on the table, all that important stuff. The extended version of the podcast is available at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can also find, as I say every week, bonus episodes, extended episodes, the MMM chat community, all of this. Please sign up for a paid subscription. It makes such an enormous difference to my ability to keep producing the podcast and grow it even bigger, produce more episodes, all that good stuff. There are other ways that you can show your support for the show as well. You can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. You can like us on YouTube. You can tell your friends and family how much you like the show. If you find it valuable, all of these things make an enormous difference to our ability to keep making it. Thank you so much.